So today's video will be talking about the anatomy of the respiratory system, and that includes the organs and the specific structures that are unique to the respiratory system. So again, the overall function of the respiratory system is to ensure that the body has enough oxygen and gets rid of or disposes the carbon dioxide that is built up during respiration. And it's important to notice that the respiratory system also works with the cardiovascular system. To ensure that the oxygen is being pumped through the body via the blood, and as we all know, the heart is responsible for pumping the blood throughout the body. Now, the major structures of the respiratory system include one external feature, which is the nose. It's the only external feature. And then working down the respiratory tract, we have the pharynx and the larynx, which are subdivided into further structures. Next, we have the trachea, or the windpipe, followed by the bronchi, which branch into the bronchioles, which both of these are found within the lungs. And the alveoli are just smaller areas where the actual place of gas exchange occurs. And this graphic shows the succession from the more macroscopic to the microscopic functions of the respiratory system. So here we obviously have our lungs, and then we have our branching bronchi, our right and left bronchi respectively, which branch into the bronchioles, and the bronchioles eventually break down into the alveoli, which are responsible for gas exchange. And then here we have the respiratory membranes, which we will talk about all of these structures throughout the PowerPoint. So first we need to talk about the two distinct passageways that are found within the respiratory system. And the conducting passageways are just, I like to call them channels, how the air gets to the respiratory passageway. And think of these: your nose, your pharynx, your larynx, your trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, almost as the highway. These are just the means or the features that allow the air to get to the respiratory passageway, which is the actual site of gas exchange. So we need to drive on the highway to get to where we want to go, which is the alveoli, which is responsible for the gas exchange. So let's begin with the only external and visible part of the respiratory system, which is the nose. And so the anatomical features of the nose include the nostrils, or the nares, and this is the spot where we inhale or breathe the air, and so we collect it through the nostrils. Next, you have the nasal cavity, which just resides inside the nose, and then the nasal septum divides the nasal cavity into these two distinct areas. And then we have our olfactory receptors that cover the entirety of our nasal cavity. And these are these almost nerve-like structures that allow for us to smell the wonderful things such as chocolate chip cookies or bacon in the morning. So, going deeper into the nose anatomy, the nose is covered with this respiratory mucosa, and it lines the entirety of the respiratory tract, from the nose all the way down to just before the lungs. And the mucosa is this very rich network of these thin-walled veins that help warm air as it passes into our respiratory tract. The reason why we breathe in warm air, or it warms the air, is so it's more comfortable for us to inhale. Think about taking a deep breath in on a cold winter's day. That's pretty uncomfortable. So our mucosa helps warm that air so it's easier to promote those gas exchanges later on in the respiratory tract. And then just underneath these mucosa, we have these superficial vessels, and they're pretty prone to nosebleeds if they become exposed. There's such a small and thin space within the nasal cavity that these vessels reside more superficially than other vessels found within our body. And next we have this mucus, which should not be confused with the mucosa. So mucus does not equal mucosa in this regard. And the mucus is there to moisten the air, and it traps the debris from entering the rest of the respiratory tract. It's almost like a first line of defense for the respiratory tract, so we're not inhaling dust and debris. And the mucus has this special lysozyme that helps destroy bacteria, which is kind of like I call it a first or a second line of defense, to ensure that we do not have respiratory tract infections from the bacteria we may be inhaling in our everyday air. And then the nasal mucosa are ciliated, or also kind of like these small hairs that move the mucus toward the throat, where it can be swallowed and digested. Think of your situations where you have postnasal drip and mucus accumulating during flu and cold season, so that it can be swallowed and digested via gastric juices. And here is an image of the cells within the nasal cavity. You can see the ciliated, or the cilia up in this top box right here, and then it's pseudo-stratified in through here. And of course, then you have the basal cells down in through here. Here is a more transverse image of the same type of cells. Again, you can see these small ciliated region in through here with our pseudo-stratified cells just underneath. So again, here is a couple of different cross sections with the goblet cells that produce the mucus, with the cilia on top with the airflow. You can see this right here. The airflow right here is flowing in this direction to ensure that the mucus travels down the esophagus to be digested. And then within our nasal cavity, we have all these types of glands, and then just beneath that we have all of our blood vessels, which are responsible for nosebleeds. So we have some bony structures within the nose, and that is comprised of the nasal concha. And there are 3 distinct bones, and they help increase the surface area for mucosa, and they increase the turbulence in the nasal cavity. And due to this increased turbulence, the particles or the dust particles are more apt to hit the mucus and prevent going farther into the respiratory tract. Next, you have the palate, which separates the nasal and oral cavities, and the hard palate is found anteriorly compared to the soft palate, and the hard palate is supported by bone, whereas the soft palate is more tissue-based, thus called a soft palate. And the hard palate is anterior, and the soft palate is posterior. Next, we have the paranasal sinuses, and we have 3 of them. You have your frontal, sphenoid, and ethmoid sinuses. And these are just empty cavities or spaces that are there to help lighten the skull, help with our speech and produce mucus, and also help with and act as nasocranial ducts. They allow just for a little bit of drainage. And on this image, we are able to see the frontal and the sphenoidal sinus. And again, with more nasal cranial ducts, the superior, middle, and inferior, that help with lightening the skull so it's not too heavy, and helping with drainage. So we typically don't think of the mouth as a means of the respiratory tract. It's typically more of a digestion area, but we are able to inhale and exhale through our mouth, and the cells that line the mouth are stratified squamous epithelial cells, and they are not the same as the cells that are found within the nasal cavity. And the squamous, if you remember, are more square-looking cells. And as I mentioned before, the hard palate is found anterior to the mouth, where the soft palate is found closer to the back of the mouth. And we will dive more into the oral cavity when we talk more about digestion. And again, these are just the cells of the mouth. You can see how the cells are more square-like and true epithelial cells, with these salivary glands towards the back and the very vasculated blood vessels. And here's another image showing the ethmoidal, frontal, and sphenoidal arteries. This is a frontal, or more of an anterior image. An anterior image. And this is a transverse. image, just showing the same types of sinuses. Moving down the respiratory tract, we have the pharynx, and it is about 5 inches or 13 centimeters long, and is typically referred to as the throat. And the pharynx continues into the nasal cavity using the posterior nasal aperture. And the pharynx has 3 subdivisions. So first you have your nasopharynx. Nasal meaning closer to the nose. So if you need to remember the location of the structures, the nasopharynx is the highest of the pharynx subdivisions, which descends into the oropharynx, which is about closer to the mouth. And then with your laryngopharynx, actual is closer to the larynx. So if you need to think of a hierarchy and remember where each are, you can use the prefixes as a hint to tell you where they are. And these 3 passageways are almost universal for air and food. We know that food travels down into the esophagus to be deposited into the rest of the digestion tract. But the food stops at the laryngopharynx to enter the esophagus, while the air is able to travel into the larynx. And here is a transverse image showing the position of the pharynx, specifically the naso, oro, and laryngopharynx. And you can see here that the esophagus is compressed right behind the trachea, and then you see it's compressed right there, and it actually gets bigger when the epiglottis is open and allows food to travel through. And then you can see the order of the pharynx, starting with the nasopharynx, and then the oropharynx, and then the laryngopharynx, which is right across from the larynx, right there. So moving on to the pharynx, continued, we have the pharyngotympanic tubes, and they drain the middle ear, and this is the area where ear infections become an issue. Because of the draining of the middle ear, it's likely to cause sore throats and other respiratory problems. If you ever had an ear infection, it is absolutely painful and not fun, and you typically have a lot of symptoms with ear infections, such as sore throats, runny noses, because you're trying to drain off that excess fluid. And then just below the pharynx, we have lymphatic tissue, which are typically referred to as tonsils in the pharynx regions. And the tonsils are there to trap and destroy pathogens that enter the respiratory tract. And the 3 tonsils that you have are the pharyngeal, or also referred to as the adenoid tonsils, and they're located high in the pharynx. Next is the palatine tonsils, and they're located more closer to the oropharynx, and they're based towards the end of the soft palate. And finally, you have your lingual tonsils, which is at the base of the tongue. And when a person has their tonsils removed, they're typically talking about the pharyngeal tonsils being removed. This used to be a bigger issue when kids would have tonsillitis a lot and they would have their tonsils removed. However, opinions are going back and forth about whether if tonsil removal is absolutely necessary. Finally, we have reached the larynx, or typically called the voice box. And it's the spot, kind of like the fork in the road, to decide whether air or food is going to enter the proper channels. So it's kind of fitting that if it's going to be food, that we call this the fork. And then it is slightly below the pharynx. And the larynx actually have these pretty cool two unique structures made of hyaline cartilages. And the first one I want to talk about is the epiglottis. And the epiglottis is essentially the gatekeeper of what goes in and out of the larynx, or what needs to go into the esophagus. And so due to its hyaline cartilage, it's kind of flexible, and it can almost act as a trap door to open and close when it is necessary. So typically the epiglottis is open during our everyday talking. So right now my epiglottis is open. However, when I start to swallow and when there's food in my mouth that needs to move through my esophagus, our larynx is able to be pulled up when we swallow, and the epiglottis acts as a gate, and it closes off the larynx so that food can go down into my esophagus. And when we begin to choke, or when we're eating and food is going down the wrong pipe, that means the food is starting to enter our larynx. And we initiate a cough reflex to try to bring that food back up into our larynx so that it can be cleared to go down into the esophagus. The second structure that uses the hyaline cartilage is is commonly referred to as the Adam's apple, that protrudes anteriorly into the neck and is more pronounced in male-bodied individuals. And this rigid hyaline cartilages are able to help form the shape of the larynx and the rest of the throat. Moving downwards, we have the mucous membrane folds, or also called the vocal folds and cords, and they're able to vibrate, so you are able to hear and able to speak, and the space has this glottis fluid that allows for the cords to vibrate and have space and create those sounds. Here is a real life image of looking down into your larynx. A couple what I think look like tonsils here and here. Here's a model of all the structures that we talked about. So right here is the epiglottis, and it's kind of C-shaped, and some like to refer to it as kind of like a spoon shape. It has that concave structure to it. Then we have our trachea, or also known as the windpipe, down here. Just gonna move that trachea down there, and all types of the different types of cartilage found in through that area. Next, the trachea, or also known as the windpipe, and it connects from the larynx, and it's about 4 inches and about the level of the 5th thoracic vertebrae. And again, you have these hyaline cartilages that are semi-flexible, but it's rigid enough to keep it open despite the pressure changes that it undergoes. And so even though it's rigid, it's flexible enough so that it can expand and move the esophagus, especially when you take too big of a bite and you need to push that large bolus down into your esophagus. And the trachea is the only spot where the ciliated mucosa traps the debris and pushes out toward the throat. So instead of going with the grain of swallowing, it actually goes against it just a little bit. It goes against the grain so that if we need to dislodge anything from our trachea, the ciliated mucosa are able to push it back up and away from the lungs. Because if debris enter our lungs, we have an increased chance of infection. Here are just some slides of the mucosa and the cilia in the trachea. So you can see just in this very small portion up through here, you have the cilia resting on top of the epithelium and the mucosa, and with the layers of cells within the trachea. And here's another diagram showing the larger portion of the trachea that is just posterior to the larynx, but superior to the beginnings of the left and right primary bronchus. And you can see the trachea is made of different types of cartilage. We have angular in between the tracheal cartilages. Moving on into the bronchi, which protrude into the lungs, you have a left and a right primary bronchi. The right is shorter than the left, and because of how the trachea feeds into the right bronchi, it's more likely for you to have objects or debris to be lodged in the right bronchi compared to the left. And the bronchi divide into smaller regions, and we name these regions just like we would in any type of biology class, starting with primary, which is bigger than secondary, and tertiary bronchi being the smallest. And these can branch more into quaternary structures. You may have heard these structures such as learning about DNA. You have primary, secondary, and tertiary structures. Same goes with bronchi. Primary is the biggest, and tertiary is the smallest. By the time that the air has reached the bronchi, it is the cleanest and warmest and the most moist air to ever have been entered into the body. It is the most purified. And then by the time it reaches into the bronchioles, which are smaller branches of the bronchi, it is absolutely perfect air. So here is a diagram showing the bronchi. So right here is the primary bronchus, which branches off into the secondary, which goes into the tertiary, and then you have the bronchiole, which is the smallest bit. The bronchioles eventually lead into the alveoli. The alveoli are just these sacs where gas exchange occurs. finally, we can talk about the powerhouse of the respiratory system, the lungs. And they're a pretty large organ compared to the other organs within the body. And they are made of elastic connective tissue, which allows them to recoil easily. They weigh about 2.5 pounds, and typically the lungs are soft, spongy, and pink. And they're able to occupy most of the thoracic cavity, except for a small area in the mediastinum. And the lungs have two areas, the apex and the base. The apex is closer to the top, and it is a bit narrow, and the base is a little larger. And we'll see this in the next slide, where everything is nice and labeled. And each lung is divided into lobes, and the right has 3 lobes and the left has 2 lobes. And then there's a bunch of fluid surrounding the lung. So we have the visceral pleura, and it interacts with the parietal pleura, and both of these pleurae secrete the pleural fluid. And the pleural fluid allows for the lungs to glide within the thoracic cavity. As you recall from the previous video, the lungs need to be able to move with the thoracic cavity to allow for maximum respiration and comfort. The pleural fluid have a strong attraction to itself, and that prevents that adhesion between the thoracic cavity and the lungs to fall apart. So here we are in with a diagram of the lungs, and as you can see, in the right lobes you have the 3 lobes, and then in the left lung you have the 2 lobes in through here. And then this blue space occupies the pleural fluid, and the lungs rest just above the diaphragm. And the lungs are able to, you're able to see in this image the bronchus, the main, and the bronchi and the bronchioles, which eventually make its way all the way down to the alveoli. The alveoli are the smallest aspect of the lungs. And they're 1 cell layer thick of squamous epithelial cells, so they're kind of square. And overlaying the alveoli is this cobweb structure of capillaries that surround them that allow for that gas exchange to occur. And they kind of look like a cluster of grapes, all stacked and neatly nestled together. And there's about 50 to 70 square meters of surface area for gas exchange. And if you're trying to conceptualize how big that is, 50 to 70 square meters is about 40 times the amount of skin surface area. So if you take all of our skin and multiply that by 40 times, that's how much surface area that is within the lungs, which is a lot. And again, as I mentioned in our last video, gas exchange likes to happen via simple diffusion, also known as passive diffusion, and that is the act of going from high concentration to low concentration. And the alveoli have their own kind of cleaning service with the alveoli macrophages, and the macrophages just kind of police the alveoli and make sure that debris does not come in and it stays out, to ensure that the air that it is doing the gas exchange with is absolutely the cleanest and purest. And then cuboidal cells within the alveoli produce surfactant, or a coating of the alveoli that helps with lung function. So here is an image of a bronchiole with alveoli. So the bronchiole has divided into the many alveoli, and you may need to zoom in, but on the alveoli you can see the blood capillaries that kind of spiderweb over them to increase the amount of gas exchange that occurs within the alveoli. And a singular air sac of an alveoli is an alveolus. And again, the alveoli is the only site where the respiratory passageway occurs. And here is a more of a macroscopic to a microscopic version onto where the respiratory membranes are. And the respiratory membrane is a membrane that allows one side with blood and the other side with oxygen. And the simple diffusion gradient is able to occur with this almost roundabout way of cycling deoxygenated and oxygenated air to help oxygenate blood. And the next image will provide you with a better graphic. So here, this is an individual respiratory membrane, and as you can see from the pulmonary artery, the blood enters the capillary, and so does the oxygen with the red blood cells. And then we are able to, via pulmonary ventilation, we're able to bring in oxygen through here to oxygenate the red blood cells, and the carbon dioxide is able to leave, and then the carbon dioxide can escape so that the red blood cells can continue. And that will conclude this video on the anatomy of the respiratory system.